is a real pleasure to welcome you all to UCL Geography and to the inaugural lecture of Professor Ben Page. My name is Jason Dittmer, and I'm here to introduce him, which is a great and personal pleasure for me. I almost didn't know where to begin with this. I spent a lot of time staring at this blank sheet of paper, but you'll be disappointed to know I managed to fill it. I think when I was trying to think about what is the essence of kind of Ben Page as a colleague and academic, is that he embodies a certain view of academia as a political and intellectual calling. I don't want to say that not all of us feel that way, but it stands out as a particular example of this. And just kind of looking back on his time at UCL, I thought, his commitment, his total commitment in some ways to students, to his colleagues, to geography as a field, to his site of research, came through in a range of different ways, and I thought I would give you just a couple of examples. One, a brief statistic, which is that since arriving at UCL, Ben has taught on 23 different modules, which is a statistic I will now wheel out when doing workload discussions with the rest of you lot. But not just in volume of teaching, but he is a fastidious teacher. Many is the time where I talked to Ben, and he told me he spent the entire afternoon revising his lectures, which were pre-existing but are now fully up to date. I thought another way of indicating his kind of generosity as an academic was when I asked him to be, for the second time I might add, the undergraduate tutor. And he'd been back in the job for a week, and I texted him and said, "How's your first week back in the job?" And his reply was, and I kid you not, "It feels good to help people again." And I remember thinking I was going to tuck that away for just such a moment as this. I think it's so telling of Ben as a scholar. And beyond that, I thought it was absolutely worth flagging up his kind of extensive commitment to working with African PhD students and African co-authors. Right? So this is someone who lives his beliefs. Again, not making comparisons to other academics, but he's up there. In terms of Ben's scholarship, I would and his kind of mode of intellect, I hope you will accept I would call him a curmudgeonly scholar. I think he would probably embrace that term. I certainly mean it affectionately. It is, I would say, a certain cultivated affect given his warmth in everyday life. But he's devoutly resists faddishness in theory. I do remember in a debate that Matthew staged back a long time ago where I was advocating about affect and non-representational theory. I remember Ben turning to the students and somewhat acidly saying, "I think a good theory is one that has stood the test of time." But his commitment is to a deep and slow, sustained engagement with place. In his case, 25 years of work in Cameroon and among its diasporas, particularly here in London, which I think certainly in geography is, I mean this again in a good way, a throwback to a previous style of research, which the kind of speeding up of life has made tenuous in academia. This kind of deep and sustained engagement of place, I think, shows in his influence with people like the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Africa, and other places where they come to him to ask what is going on. And I wanted to conclude, though, with a slightly more personal note, that Ben is my oldest and dearest friend in this country. And I think that friendship is rooted in what many of us have experienced, which is his deep commitment to all people, whether they're students, colleagues, friends. I think many of us here, and I think the size of this crowd probably speaks to the fact that we've all been, addressed by Ben in this particularly committed way. He's a true friend to many of us. In addition, as an immigrant to this country, I found him a fount of wisdom on all topics British. So when I want to know about gardening, I go to Ben. When I want to know about property values in Greenwich. When I want to get into local industrial history. Did you know there were lime pits in Lewisham? I did not. And then, hopefully, if you haven't experienced this, you will. Ben's incredible love of cooking and his hearth is a wonderful place to gather around for hospitality. My wife and I very recently gave him a cookbook of food that we wanted to eat. And Ben very, very happily served us up an incredible meal. And he is going to serve up an incredible meal for you guys today. And I think it's best if I stand aside and let Ben take the stage. But let me be the first to say thank you in advance, Ben, for this lecture.
Thank you very much, Jason, and to Richard and Claire, who's going to speak later. It's wonderful to see you all, and it's a real privilege to have this opportunity. I teach in here on a Friday. We're back in here on a Friday with the second year. You look every bit as youthful and twice as engaged as they do on Friday at 12. I'm particularly pleased that some of my anthropology colleagues are here. Most social scientists who work on Cameroon are anthropologists, and I've drawn a lot of sustenance over many years from their writing and friendship as well. And then finally, for the film, which I'm being filmed, I think, by Lecturecast, I'd also like to name check my colleagues in universities of Douala and the University of Boya, and in South Africa at UCT and in Durban, who kind of all wanted to be here but couldn't be. All right. So I've been undertaking work, as Jason said, with Cameroonians in Cameroon and in the diaspora for nearly 30 years. I've got two aims of what I want to do tonight. First, I'm going to look back and reflect on some of the lessons I've learnt, which are as much about myself and how I think about research as they are about social change in Cameroon. And second, I thought it would be fun for me, perhaps not for you, to keep that reflection fresh by kind of doing it through a new lens, and in particular this concept of extimacy, and as an extension of that, also some ideas about masking, which I've drawn from the kind of World in Common African Photography exhibition that's currently on, or just ended actually, at Tate Modern. So the plan for the lecture is that I've got 45 minutes, so you can start wriggling if I go over that. And furthermore, it's ever so hot in here. So if anybody does feel faint or anything, feel free. Don't feel embarrassed about leaving. And there's a door at the back if you don't want to get out the front and draw attention to yourself. So don't feel embarrassed if you do feel faint, because it's so hot. And apparently we do have an engineer on their way to try and repair the air conditioning. But knowing UCL, and I am on record and I am being filmed, they will turn up at about 10 to 8 or something like that, and then be a spectacle. All right. So my second aim was this idea of kind of looking back through this lens of extimacy. And on reflection, this was probably a mistake and it feels a bit crazy, but I felt compelled to do it anyway. Like Cameroon, psychoanalytic ideas have always intrigued me and have always been perpetually just beyond my understanding. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of just really quickly run over the research I've done. Then I'm going to spend some time talking about that key concept of extimacy, and then I'm going to switch to talk about 4 different research projects as speedily as possible. Kind of one is about my doctoral work, but that's really not so much about the findings of the doctorate, but more about what I learned about myself. And then some work on kind of migrant housing, diaspora house building, and some work on interior decoration and the Cameroonian middle class. And then finally some work on international development and the diaspora, after which you will all deserve a break. So kind of the first 10 years or so of my research career, I kind of focused under this umbrella of political ecology, which is really about the relationship between nature and society, and that involved a lot of work looking at water infrastructure, water governance, water and gender politics. And I've had some great PhD students kind of working along those themes, so I'd like to credit my PhD students who I've worked with over the years, some of whom are in the room as well. And so then after kind of 10 years of doing that, I kind of moved into migration studies, which was a bit of a swerve, but it kind of came out of kind of some interest with some work that I was doing with Claire Mercer around diasporas and the contribution they make to development, and that's kind of been an ongoing theme and something I still work on. And then out of that came this block in the bottom left, where I've become more interested in urban and social change during this particular period of African history from around the turn of the millennium to around 2015, which is sometimes called, mostly by the editors of The Economist and that kind of journal, the Africa Rising period, which was a period of economic prosperity and kind of generated the kind of idea that there was a new middle class. So we were kind of looking at that and their impacts on a particular city in Cameroon. And then throughout, I've kind of also been interested in histories of colonial development and development policy and decolonization. And then, sadly, in recent years, I've also started writing about conflict and security following the outbreak of war in the part of Cameroon where I work in 2016. So that's my entire life's work on a single slide. Right. Get my timings right. All words are made up, but some words are more made up than others. And the word extimacy, or more strictly extimate, makes its first recorded appearance on February the 10th, 1960, created or coined by the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. And unlike many Lacanian concepts, I think if you were going to have a go at guessing at what it means, you'll probably get quite close. It's probably why Lacan didn't use it very much. It was a bit too comprehensible. So what I'm going to try and do is something very un-Lacanian, which is to try and treat this one concept kind of separately and ignore the rest of his elaborate conceptual apparatus, which is inappropriate, but it's the only way I could think of doing this so that it made some sense. So extimacy is obviously a neologism that is a compound of intimacy and exteriority. Exteriority, that's easy, that's just a fancy way of saying outside or outsider or outsiderness, something like that. So that's the exteriority bit. Intimacy, a little bit more complicated, derived from the Latin superlative of interior, intimus, so it is the most interior, the deepest point of the interior. And beyond being a coy euphemism for sex, intimacy is usually taken to describe the consensual sharing of deeply personal information. And to share such information requires reciprocal trust, a willingness to disclose emotions, and a capacity for self-disclosure. So that kind of connection and sharing of information is about that deeply personal information, the deep feelings that we have within us. And that might emerge in a kind of professional setting, like in therapy. It might emerge between lovers, between siblings, between friends. And there's a great novel by my friend and colleague, the Cameroonian anthropologist Francis Nyamjo, called Intimate Strangers, which is about a researcher, because he writes novels about his own research. It's about a researcher who kind of is undertaking research on the relationship between maids and mistresses. And so that's the kind of intimacy, is kind of that connection, but strangers because it's a professional relationship. And he uses that as a vehicle for exploring questions of foreigner and indigent and xenophobia between Africans and within post-colonial Africa. So to go back to extimacy and how Lacan is using it, his point, the main point here, is to question the common sense distinction that we have between the inside and the outside, between the deep inside and the outside in relation to human subjects. So it's about rejecting a strong distinction between an inside and an outside of ourselves. So instead, Lacan, who was fond of purloining kind of images from mathematics, wanted to reimagine the relationship between inside and outside as being a bit like a Möbius strip. And by problematizing this relationship between inside and outside, this concept calls into a question of other often taken for granted distinctions. For example, the boundary between a subject's inner mental world and their outer social world, or between the individual core of a personality and their wider culture, between the private depth and the public surface. Like most new ideas, it's possible to find antecedents And any retired vicars or RE teachers who might happen to be in the room will know that the origin of this idea could be related in the Western tradition, perhaps to St. Augustine, and his conception of the soul, which is of the exterior, but is more inward to me than my most inward part. So the idea is that the external, the soul, God, is outside us, and yet when we look within us, it's inside us. So that's this blurring of the inside and outside that I think Lacan is also wrestling with. As one commentator puts it of St. Augustine, introspection is, for St. Augustine, not private at all. Well, that's a bit promising. Patience. Richard hasn't gone yet. Okay. Oh dear, that's not what we wanted. This is the bit where I panic. That's where. It's because I clicked on the link, isn't it? We hope. That's better. Panic over. Now we've gone too forward. Right, okay, back to Lacan. So, remember we're talking about the inside and the outside, and this is an extension of a kind of broader kind of idea within a lot of psychoanalytic thought that questions the idea that the person, the ego, the subject, is contiguous with their body. So here, Lacan, speaking in the 1970s, but about his work from the 1930s, is talking about the mirror phase, talking about the subject. Strictly speaking, he doesn't have the slightest idea of his body. He thinks that's me. When we look at our bodies, we think that's me, that's who I am. Everybody thinks it's himself. It's not, it's a whole. It's an absence. And outside of it, there's an image. So this is kind of trying to kind of challenge that idea that the geographical space of the human's body is in itself an illusion, misleading, and it's misleading to think of one's answer to the question, who am I? As, well, whoever I am, I'm inside my skin. The subject's body, despite our own conscious senses to the contrary, is not a space of autonomous agency, the seat of the free, true I determining its own fate, is Lacan's point. And within African studies and post-colonial theory, probably the most famous extension of these ideas is Frantz Fanon's text, Black Skin, White Masks, in which Fanon records this key moment in 1944 when he's travelling on a train from Algeria to Colmar, fighting in the war, where he was awarded the Croix de Guerre. So it's a Martinican, Caribbean soldier who joined the Free French Army. And on this journey on the train through France, a young white boy points to him and says, "Look, a Negro." And initially, Fanon laughs it off, but he ceases to laugh. I could no longer laugh, as he feels himself becoming the body of a black man, with all the historical baggage connected to that body in the eyes of the white boy looking at him. And so we have this distinction here between what he calls his corporeal schema, his body, and his epidermal schema, the way he's viewed from outside. But as the geographer Steve Pyle has argued, the epidermal schema is comprised of more than just racist imagery and discourses. It is also bodily. So it's not just that these ideas of the black man are being projected onto, superimposed onto the skin from outside. Rather, Fanon argues, they actually compose the body. So there's this kind of twisting of the inside and the outside. So those ideas compose the body's relationship to the world beyond from within. Now, if this all seems a bit highfalutin and rather counterintuitive, this idea that ourselves are not our bodies, then I'm going to try and draw out 2 points which maybe you can connect to and see how this might work. So first of all, some of our most intimate feelings can feel extremely foreign to us. Why is it, for example, that we often feel driven against our wishes to return to some slight or hurt from the past, to revisit or remember that annoying thing we did or said years ago, where does that unwanted drive to repeat, to return to that again and again come from? We consciously know it would be better to drop it and move on, but we feel these compulsions that seem to come from outside us and yet are deep within. The outside seems to be present on the inside. So that's the first kind of way of thinking about it. And then to flip that round, our intimate feelings can be attached to physical objects outside us without losing their sincerity or their significance. So, for example, if you think about the poppies that some people choose to wear in November, they embody deeply treasured feelings about family, genealogy, war, sacrifice, service, and memory in a profound way that bears little relationship to their flimsy structure of paper and plastic. And those feelings from deep within are no longer buried deeply and privately inside the person, but are external and publicly revealed on lapels. But the claim that Lacan makes is that the poppy isn't just symbolizing our feeling, it's not a symbol of our feeling, it's actually doing our feeling for us, thereby allowing us the time we need to get on with our everyday lives. We need the poppy to do that feeling so that we can make a cup of tea or go to work and just get on with life. It's doing the feeling for us. The inside is present on the outside. So one of the common behaviors among very young people diagnosed with autistic spectrum disorder is that they can have a tendency to overshare their intimate thoughts. They often lack the impulse control that's considered neurotypical when encountering strangers, so they spill out personal details, they interrupt conversations, they repeat the same point and speak at inappropriate times, and in an effort to reach out for contact. And eventually, the unsatisfactory kind of outcome of that leads those people to kind of feel that maybe they lack the gene for conversation, and instead they start to mask their behaviour by retreating inside themselves in order not to stand out too much. And in this respect, the process of masking seems initially to accord to the ideas of Dr. Arthur Neumann, a fictional Freudian therapist from the 1994 Jim Carrey film The Mask, a film I first watched on VHS, pirated probably, with my friend Chris Ikungwe and his family in Boya, and I remember them really loving that film, and that really fascinated me. And he's plugging his book, which is called The Masks We Wear, on a TV chat show, and he says, "We all wear masks, metaphorically speaking. We suppress the id, our darkest desires, and adopt a more socially acceptable image." So in this view, the mask is fake, covering our authentic inner self in order to pass socially. Yet, the story of the film actually suggests the exact opposite. When the Jim Carrey character puts on the mask, he's transformed from this timid bank clerk and romantic failure into a super-confident, amoral Lothario and bank robber. And key to this is the idea that prior to his transformation, he watches cartoons endlessly. And when he puts on the mask, he really becomes a cartoon, able to dodge bullets, eyeballs popping out on stalks, and instilling a kind of joyous, liberated idiocy into the policeman trying to arrest him. In short, his darkest desires inhabit the mask that he puts on. And Lacan's claim, therefore, is that though these masks, metaphorical masks that we all wear on the outside, nevertheless they are authentically us, that the truth lies in the mask, not underneath the mask, because they're about abandoning the effort to control our impulses, and therefore they allow us an expression of our deep desires. So that idea that the mask is hiding the authentic self is what he's rejecting and overturning. So literal masks are obviously a vital part of cultural heritage in many African traditions, and often in these cases, to put on the mask is to blur the boundary between an outside material world and an inner spiritual world, often associated with ancestors or the dead. And in our most recent research, Emile Sunjo and I have been talking to people in Boya about witchcraft accusations that are made against people who build big houses. So if you build a big house and decorate it beautifully, sometimes you become the object of a witchcraft accusation. And so we've been talking to people who are kind of accused, and as a result we've learned a bit about this particular masquerade called Obasanjo, which has its origins several hundred miles to the northeast of Buea, amongst the Ajagam and Banyan communities. But it's been used by the Bakweri for identifying witches since the 1950s. And the mask has the form of a feather-headed crocodile and a flowing robe, and when you see it, it kind of moves in a really strange kind of gliding fashion. And Obasanjo is used to identify a particular variety of witchcraft called Nyongo, and it's Nyongo that's the accusation made against these house builders. Now, on the one hand, there's a really long-standing and convincing analysis of this sort of movement between witchcraft accusation and then witch-finding using this kind of masquerade, which is that it performs a social function around kind of managing inequality, economic inequality. So what happens is that where there's a concentration of wealth that is perceived to be inappropriate, then the accusation of witchcraft gets made, and then you bring in the kind of witch finder who identifies a number of witches, and that means that the rest of the population who aren't witches, who aren't identified as witches, can get on with the business of making money. And so it's about managing inequality. So it kind of is a sort of dialectic between this sort of sense of an accusation is made and then there's a response. So it's a kind of sort of reasonable kind of inequality that's permitted to evolve. But that kind of analysis is, and that I'm drawing heavily here on the work of Edwin Ardner from the 1970s, that kind of analysis also has to take account of the fact that Africans clearly intend this in a very literal and factual sense, and that this analysis kind of treats it metaphorically and says it has this social function. So there is this sense that when the people wear the mask and are possessed by it, they enter a state between the material world and the world of the ancestors where they kind of cede control to the mask. And I think my sense is that we need to kind of take the kind of that sense of losing control more at face value than that social analysis kind of allows for. All right, so that is extimacy. And I hope that all of you who've been emailing me and sending me WhatsApp messages throughout the day about what does this word extimacy mean have a bit of a better sense now that what we're wrestling with is a kind of discussion about inside and outside. And furthermore, at this point, it's possible that some of you, especially my guests from outside the university world, might be wondering what on earth happened to geography since I did my O-levels. Haven't had any Oxbow Lakes, no central business districts yet. And there's certainly no maps, so especially for Paul down the front here and James, we have a map for anybody who doesn't know where Cameroon is. So if you look down here, we've got the Nigeria and Cameroon, and there we are. And I think looking back at the reason I find this concept useful and the reason I wanted to work with it was that I've always been interested in how humans experience, interpret and represent the relationship between our external and internal worlds. And I found that really interesting. But if you're wondering why it might also be important, then I would kind of ask you to think about the concept instead of identity. So identity is perhaps a much more familiar concept, and one that we can recognize: national identities, religious identities, gender identities, racial identities, as part of the play of politics in a much more direct way than what I've been talking about. But what I dislike about the concept of identity is that in some ways, when we reach for that term, we tend to stop thinking because we know what it means. So there's a kind of concern I have that the kind of, on the one hand, we can see that identity is important. You know, we only need to think about the tragic events that are occurring in Israel and Palestine at the moment to think of the role that identity plays in politics and why it matters. But it is, in essence, also one of these ideas that's about how somebody's internal sense of who they are gets presented externally. If I present myself as a straight white European male, that's my identity, that's who I am inside, and I'm presenting that to you as a public form of my identity. So it's about the internal being expressed externally. So it's the same idea, but the reason I want to use extimacy is that it's unfamiliar and it might help us see these things in a different way. It also strikes me as useful because for a geographer, it is one of the more obviously spatial concepts that Lacan uses. So next I'm going to kind of turn to some of the kind of work I've done to try and, on the one hand, kind of think about what I've done and say some of the results, and then think again about it through this through this kind of idea of extimacy. And one way that it strikes a chord for me is that it draws attention to visible surfaces rather than hidden depths. And the very first International Geography conference I attended was the AAG meeting in Pittsburgh, when I organised a session at which Phil Krang and Ian Cook spoke about research that they were doing on hot pepper sauce. And they were kind of very kind of anti-depth metaphors, and I kind of think that's kind of, so going back kind of 20 years is when I started kind of being interested in this critique of the idea that the truth lay in depths and hiddens. And I think the stereotype of geographers as a kind of jack of all trades and master of none, that's usually considered in a derogatory way because it implies superficiality and a lack of deep expertise. Instead, perhaps we might wear it as a badge of honour, celebrating surface expertise as a different kind of academic strategy, the capacity to pick and choose ideas from different sources like a magpie rather than digging deep like a miner. So I think I only really kind of worked this out about myself, that I was more comfortable kind of skimming on the surface of things rather than digging deep, kind of after completing my PhD, and the PhD was kind of a part of the process of doing so. So the PhD was a kind of an attempt to tell a really gripping history of the introduction of domestic water billing to Cameroon between about 1920 and 1990. In a context where, you know, a lot of people were talking about at the time the commodification of nature, and this was a context in which many households were still peasant farmers, small-scale farmers, or first-generation urban migrants in my historical material, certainly. And what I found was that, contrary to lots of my colleagues who were kind of writing about accumulation by dispossession, contrary to the kind of many of the opponents of water privatization that were kind of in play in the 1990s, lots of Cameroonians, both in the present, in the interviews I was doing, but also in the historical archive material, were quite happy to pay for water and for safe water. What people objected to was a poor service and an unfair allocation of the costs, regardless of whether the water was delivered by state or a private business or by the community. And the colonial story was about inadequate infrastructure. The post-colonial one was shaped by a government that used the water corporation as a source of emergency cash when it needed it, and the post-privatization one in Cameroon combines an inhuman focus on cost recovery with a failure to improve the service, which is a remarkable achievement. So, understandably, Cameroonian citizens are pretty irked by the failures of water supply over the last 100 years. And what's happened recently, in the last 10 years or so, is that now individuals in this city, which has a phenomenally high level of rainfall and is on a mountainside and has streams and rivers all over the place, are actually drilling their own private boreholes and having completely independent water supplies that have no connection to the infrastructural system. Anyway, that was the PhD. And under the guidance of my supervisor, a guy called Eric Schwingedau, I went deep into obscure corners of 1970s French neo-Marxism, reading anthropologists like Claude Meursault and Pierre-Philippe Ray, who seemed to be wrestling with how to talk about capitalism in places where it wasn't entirely clear that capitalism even existed. So it was a desperate attempt to try and find something new to say conceptually within the crowded field of political ecology in the late 1990s. And so committed was I to this kind of academic idea of going deep that I even borrowed Eric's heavily annotated copy of Volume 3 of Capital, which I now confess I got no further than page 10. And about 10 years after finishing my PhD, I kind of had this moment of revelation when I realized what I was really interested in the PhD was how it was that some people came to be constructed as willing to pay their water bills, and some people still resisted that. And actually what I was talking about was sort of entirely different suite of concepts: governmentality, biopolitics, discipline, which ironically most cutting-edge geographers had stopped talking about just when I was doing my PhD, but that's okay. The point I learned, the point I'm trying to make here, is that not that one analytical framework was wrong and another was right, but that the choices we make about the concepts we use are highly contextual, and that the measure of their value really lies in whether or not they let us see anything new. So what I've learnt about myself is that theoretical loyalty that underpins going deep is for me generally unproductive. I find it hugely impressive in other people, and I reach for them to help me get the gist of things as I skim over the top. So I'm not saying that isn't another way to work. Equally, many of my colleagues, I recognise, are loyal to particular theoretical approaches, such as feminist theory or Marxist theory, as part of an ethical commitment to a particular personal political commitments. But happily, as a supporter of the current leadership of the Labour Party, I don't have that problem. So eclecticism is fine. Superficial patchwork attitude to theory is all right in my book, and that's what I've learnt about myself. And as my Cameroonian fellow student of Cameroon, David Zeitlin, professor of anthropology at Oxford, has recently argued, it's better to imagine the approach as more like a collage, a coherent image, but one in which these different elements remain distinct. And what has provided this collage with coherence for me are two things: the ethnographic method and a long-term commitment to place. All right, we're doing okay for time. So, on to some actual research projects where you might learn a little bit about Cameroon. So, there's a really, really interesting thing happening all over the world, and that is what Emile and I have been looking at in relation to Cameroon. And all over the world, international migrants, having established themselves in the country where they've moved to, are building houses back in the country they came from. And it's a really big field. There's lots of people working all over this. You can find examples from Macedonia, Mexico, Madagascar, Manila, all the M's. And all over the world you find some things that are the same: pillars, porticos, and invocations of social relationships, but every place has its own version of the narrative, its own iteration. So Emile and I have been looking at some of these houses, and we've been asking all the obvious empirical questions. You know, what's the process? Why does it happen? What's interesting about it? And we've been looking at the way that these obviously quite large, quite modern, quite expensive houses are kind of shaping the city where they're being built. And what we found was that kind of in the last kind of 2 decades, these kind of investments have been driving a rapid expansion of the city, a different kind of housing, as apartment buildings and student halls of residence as well. And we think that the city has grown by at least a third since we've been following it and been tracking these new houses. We found it isn't just migrants, local elites as well, putting up these houses, often bigger, flashier houses, in fact, than the migrants who struggle with these building projects because they're physically located thousands of miles away. Local government regulation of this process is rather perverse, kind of knowingly foregoing tax revenue in order for bureaucrats to harvest rents, while justifying that as part of fostering development. And public infrastructure has lagged a long way behind private development, so services like electricity and water supply being stretched in irrational ways to meet the individual needs of wealthy homeowners. So it's kind of that's what we've done, and then how could we kind of think about that again through the kind of lens of extinacy. I thought I'll put that one in just so you see how beautiful Cameroon is. Pause. We're actually kind of just about making it out. I'm keeping the name of these villages anonymous, but you can just about see there's a village down there. We're actually and we were driving towards it one day on the road, and he pulled up the pickup, and he stopped the pickup, and he looked at me, and he said, quote, "Sometimes I ask myself why I do it. What's it for? It's a crazy thing to do, but I do it anyway." And that is a sentence that really lends itself to psychoanalytic analysis. He's not short of convincing answers to his own question. So he's got all these conscious answers to his own question. He's building this house because his dad told him to. He specifically wants it to have it ready for some kind of village ceremonies, where it will become an important part of the ceremony, known as a cry house, during the death celebrations, where he'll be able to host his guests. He's building this house so that he himself can be buried there, either inside the house or adjacent to it. He's building the house because some of his brothers have already built his house and he's in competition with them, explicitly. He's building this house so that his American kids can come and feel at home and relaxed in Cameroon. And he's building this house for himself. It's where he comes to relax on vacation. He's building this house because he wants to modernize the village. He wants to provide opportunities and support local craftsmen. So all these are entirely plausible, conscious answers, and still he asks himself, why am I doing it? His own questions are insufficient. His own answers, are insufficient. There's still something beyond his control that needs explanation. So the argument that I develop in the paper that's cited here is that the kind of conception of the psychoanalytic conception of subject formation, which involves exchanging certain freedoms for belonging to a community, has affinities to the bargain that's struck between a migrant like this, a transnational migrant, and their ancestral home village. So it's about kind of how you leave and stay connected, about being inside the village and outside the village at the same time. So in his discussion of the northern Batsileo of Madagascar, the anthropologist Luc Freeman interprets the village houses built by migrants as expressions of the builder's autonomy. He reports that there are these large modern houses built by migrants that tower over the homes of their village relatives, that the owners then deliberately allow to fall into disrepair. So they go back to the village, build a big fancy house, and then let it fall down. They deliberately don't maintain it. And his argument is that they're doing that as a visible sign of the fact that they've left, that they no longer care, that they've kind of moved away, they are autonomous, the kind of village has no power over them anymore. In contrast, my Cameroonian friend, companion, seems firmly bound by the commands made by the village. Return, build, remember us, honour your father, never sell this land, bring us your children. And in return for following these orders, he experiences the pleasures of belonging that help him overcome the traumas of transnationalism. This is where he comes to truly rest. This is where he feels most at home. This is where he's confident that he will be cared for after he's dead. This is the deal he's struck. He accepts the prohibition, you may not leave, in exchange for participation and belonging. The house, now it's built, is a labour-saving device. The house isn't just the realisation of his dream of an easy life in the village, it's doing the dreaming for him. It saves him the labour of constantly connecting with his community and family by speaking on its surface, on its outside, of his desire to be in the village, even when he isn't there, when he's back in the US. It allows him to get on with the pleasures of his transnational life, like taking his kids to Disneyland, in the time that's been saved by not going home to the village. It does the emotional work for him. Its surface expresses his deep desire to enjoy life before the same house becomes the site of a tomb that will be cared for in the future, because, as he cheerfully told me and definitely believed, quote, most of your life is after you're dead. And if, as Freud argued in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, the primary purpose of your life is to find the correct path to death, then the interviewee was taking it very literally. All right. Next one. Yes, timings. Okay, so now we're on to the domestic interiors. And this was a kind of project which was about kind of this idea that there's a new middle class that's emerged in Africa. And there's lots of hope being placed on this middle class that it's going to challenge corruption and kind of demand good governance and all these kind of things, which is kind of an absurd burden to place on this group of prosperous households who've benefited from this period of economic growth at the beginning of the millennium. And in conversation with Claire and others, several of us were kind of talking about how to try and empirically explore this claim that this new class emerged, and we kind of alighted on how people decorated houses as one way to do that. So parlours are particularly interesting, or front rooms, lounges, sitting rooms, whatever you want to call them. Parlours is the idiomatic Cameroonian phrase. Parlours are an interesting space because they're kind of part of a private space, they're inside the house, but they're also the most public part of the private space because they're where you allow guests into and bring guests into. So it's a kind of controlled public inspection into this space. And having done the work with the houses, looking at how kind of the city was changed as a result of these migrant investments, here what we were looking at was how society is changing, and using our kind of discussions with these homeowners to kind of explore this idea of a new middle class and see whether we could find one. Our own hypothesis was really that whilst this class exists quite convincingly in terms of the statistics of the African Development Bank and the work of Finance Minister of the Year 2023, Ntuli Nkube, kind of Zimbabwe's Finance Minister, which is a remarkable achievement to be Finance Minister of the Year and be Zimbabwe's Finance Minister, but okay. So he's one of the big kind of writers about the middle class, using lots of economic data to kind of claim that it exists, and our hunch was that it's kind of much harder to identify. But in line, and we did indeed find that we couldn't find a single style. What we found was that there was a kind of boundary being drawn between a certain group of households and other households. So there's a kind of boundary making exercise, which you could see possibly as kind of class formation. But within that boundary, these prosperous families, these prosperous households didn't really have much in common. They certainly didn't see themselves as a kind of social group. They didn't have shared social interests, and they certainly didn't have a shared kind of style of decoration. And in line with kind of the previous argument about the kind of rural village house, you could see these parlours as doing work on behalf of their homeowners, doing the work of social boundary making. But what I want to do now is flip it round, and if that argument is about deep interior feelings being placed on the outside onto the house, if you flip it round, can we find ways in which you can internalise exteriority, what the geographer Paul Kingsbury describes as the stirring and blooming of people's inner feelings and thoughts by an external object, the external object being, in this case, these houses. And other geographers have been here before. So in her discussion of the space of psychoanalytic consulting rooms in North London, Felicity Callard has systematically explored the relationship between the couch and the chair and the therapist and the analysand and the room. And there are therapists in the room. I know at least 2 therapists are in the room, and I know that they take the space of their therapy very seriously. So this idea that these external spaces could have important impacts on our internal feelings isn't that unusual. The rooms Emile and I were investigating were rather less minimalist in their contents, generally more baroque than the kind of psychoanalytic kind of consulting rooms of North London. And unlike the kind of carefully staged kind of relationship in that setting, these are the sites of everyday life, distillations of repeated habits, social practices routinely undertaken day after day. So our interviewees, and we did about 25 of these interiors, spending kind of a couple of days visiting and revisiting, talking to people about their choices of decoration and how they use the space, sometimes, hanging out, having dinner and that kind of thing, and kind of seeing how people come and visit. And how these spaces get used by different people, not just by their owners as well, how other people see them. And what we kind of concluded, as I say, was there's no single style, there's no single class, no single sort of middle class. But what I'm now asking is, can we kind of consider the Lacanian claim that these spaces, as Kingsbury puts it, stir up these intimate feelings, quote, like a foreign body, a parasite. And I want to start by kind of treating this as kind of, there's a kind of play between the literal and the metaphorical here, and kind of Freud, and I want you to kind of, as I'm talking here, particularly this image on the right. So Freud kind of uses domestic interiors metaphorically, so he talks about the way that the kind of, imagine two rooms, a large hall, that's symbolic of or metaphor for the unconscious, and then there's a small parlour just beyond, which is kind of for the conscious, and then the door between the two is guarded so that kind of your urges can't move from the big hall to the small parlour. So you're that's kind of policed by the superego, according to Freud. So he uses domestic interiors metaphorically, and kind of it was as if for my convenience this evening that the owner of that room on the right, so it has this great big hall. So we have the entrance hall, we have Freud's hall, and you can just see at the back in the middle, can't quite make out under this lighting, there's a private family parlour just through that door, so there's a small parlour beyond, and there's a door between the two. And what kind of really fascinated us, and he impressed this on us several occasions, it wasn't just once, he kind of mentioned it several times, that because he lived in the US, he was a transnational migrant, and because he lived in the US, he'd learnt about openness and flow, and every time he came back to Cameroon, his builders had put a door into that space, and every time he had it removed. So he wanted a free flow of people to kind of move through the building. So how do these parlours get under people's skin? And I think to explore this, we need to think not just about the homeowners and the house builders, but we need to bring in a second group, which is the other residents in the city. Households that can't afford to build and decorate these big new villas. And for them, there's a completely different suite of emotions. So for the homeowners, it's all about pride and satisfaction. But for the other people, there's this critique that this is really irrational. Why do you need such a big house? How are they going to maintain such a big property in this climate? Why build a story building in an area where they're prone to tremors from volcanic eruptions? So all these kind of critiques that come in from the neighbours who are kind of expecting it, and those critiques then slip from the building to the person who's doing the building as well. So this is somebody talking about his uncle, and he's critiquing the fact that his uncle's mean. So this takes you back to that idea of this kind of social controls over inequality, that there are these kind of pressures that can be put on people. All right. So what people objected to was this kind of sense that somebody else had got it sussed. So you've got the group of people who kind of are looking on these houses and kind of seeing people who seem to have got it sussed. And yet the people who are kind of building these houses also kind of felt never satisfied, that they would build the house, and then as soon as they've done it, they realised it didn't satisfy their needs, and whilst they were pleased with their achievements, they had to move on to the next thing. And this is a quote from one of the builders, showing that they're very aware of the fact that their kind of neighbours are critiquing what they're doing and the way they're working. So the point is that there's this kind of sense of a critique from the other neighbours of the enjoyment that the homeowners are feeling, whilst the homeowners themselves feel their enjoyment has been rather punctured by this critique of their neighbours. And anyway, the house didn't, these excessive, great big houses that caused them to suffer so much in their building, didn't really actually satisfy them anyway. Now, one of the things that's going on here is also about masculinity. And it is quite a common idea that in order to be a man, quite a common Cameroonian idea, that in order to be a man, you have to build a house. So in certain communities, if you want to speak in public, if you want to kind of pronounce at meetings, then people might challenge you and say, well, where's your house? Did you build a house? Are you allowed to speak? So there is this kind of culture of kind of associating these houses with masculinity. In one of our interviews, described himself as a patron of the arts. I was kind of a bit puzzled. And I looked around the house, everything seemed to be mass-produced. Why are you a patron of the arts? And he said, well, we let local musicians use the house to shoot their videos. So we tracked down the video in question. And I'll show you a short clip in a minute. And what it turned out was it wasn't his house at all. It was his neighbour's house that was used in the video, but fortunately that was a house where we'd also done research. That house kind of is... I've lost my... There it is. So here's the house we're talking about. And here's some lyrics from the song that I'm going to play you in just a second. So this house is really interesting because it looks like a house, but it's actually an apartment block. There's kind of 6 different apartments inside what looks like a house. There's 6 different members of the same family. They've all got a different unit. And so it's kind of a reimagining, a spatial urban reimagining of the rural idea that the different groups of a family huddle around a shared open space. And you'll see the shared open space in the video in a minute. So on the ground floor, they have common space where the different members of the family can meet for family meetings and gatherings. And then they have their private apartments. Some of them live here permanently. Some of them are transnational migrants. The song, which is called Calais, was the 2017 breakthrough track for Daphne, one-time prominent Cameroonian star. And with over 30 million views on YouTube, this is one of the most widely seen Cameroonian music videos of all time. And therefore, coincidentally, one of the most widely seen Cameroonian houses of all time, which is what really interests me. It's just possible that Emile and I are the only people more interested in the house than the singer. She sings in a mixture of French and English, and if you look at the last line, also Pidgin. Je suis calé kind of means I'm stuck. So it's a straightforward kind of romantic love song. What the house and the video shows is that this is a relationship between particular domestic spaces, fantasy, and excessive enjoyment of the other. And I think also to think back to the Freud and the parlour and the hall. So what you've got here is, instead of that discussion of the superego guarding the door, we've got the traditional male fantasy of a seductress standing at the threshold of the house, which is itself a popular Cameroonian euphemism. Here she is, and you're going to get about 30 seconds of this, and then I'm going to have to skip because of time and cut to my... So here you have the fascinating domestic interior, which is what I'm interested in. So he's prepared her fufu and eru, and he's hidden the engagement ring inside the fufu. So which you have to understand the next bit. So. Okay, that's enough of that. All right, so I'm up against it with time, aren't I? I'm going to race through the next section, which is about what I call dreams of development. So I've done over the years quite a lot of work on international development, and the kind of point of these slides was that, on the one hand, kind of whenever we talk to kind of Cameroonians about development, it's a very straightforward desire for improved infrastructure, improved projects. This is true of work I did way back at the beginning with Francis Nyamjo, talking to young people about their dreams of progress. It's true also of this work that's illustrated here, working with the Cameroonian diaspora here in Hackney in London, talking about what they were looking for home. So we have, on the one hand, this kind of straightforward desire for kind of infrastructure, for projects, for development, for progress. And yet, on the other hand, as a teacher, I spend my time teaching students that development is deeply problematic, that it's all about propping up venal regimes, that it doesn't kind of cover its costs, that it's all about reproducing and sneaking. Patricia is in the audience here, taught me all this stuff when I was undergraduate. The the critique of development. So we've got this paradox that on the one hand, the people I talk to and spend time with want development. On the other hand, I know from my literature that it's kind of deeply problematic. And kind of one easy way there would be to kind of say, well, there's a kind of mask going on here that we kind of might call false consciousness. These people are deluded, and they're kind of, if they only knew the true kind of nature of development, they would resist it. And I think that's a really deeply problematic way to think about this. And what some of the kind of Lacanian thinking, I think, can do for us is to take seriously those dreams and to try and kind of do something more productive with that. But I do understand why people are disappointed. So this is a picture from 1964, which was the first water project that I could find from the kind of post-colonial period, the first project that was started and finished in post-colonial Cameroon, post-colonial water project, and you can see the kind of levels of technology going on there. And then when I was doing my work in the late 1990s, you can see that basically, for some people, this is still the same, that there's kind of really paucity of progress. And I think one of the things that Claire would be really disappointed with me if I didn't manage to sneak E.R. Chadwick in here somewhere. So this is some of my historical work about the histories of development. And I kind of think that one of the things that's really interesting here is the kind of emergence of how you instill these dreams and how you get these ideas of what progress is. And what we have here is work from the late 1940s, and the white man in the middle, who was a district officer in eastern Nigeria, worked also in Cameroon, is explaining to the black man what dreams he should have, basically, and how he should then translate those dreams in a public meeting in the still on the right. And that translates into a development project in which Africans do self-help development, participating in their project. But of course the point is that self-help requires a self-help guru. So you have to have somebody from the outside who tells you how you can have this internal form of development. And one of the things that Claire and Martin, who's here as well, and I found really interesting about what the diaspora was doing is that it kind of stands outside this kind of problem with development because people were just getting on and doing their own thing. So this is a project from a place called Balinyonga, again in northwest Cameroon. But it's about this building, which is in the picture, which is a mortuary attached to the hospital. And this was what people told us was the main development project that they'd delivered as a kind of group of migrants who wanted to develop their hometown. So it's kind of an odd thing to do, right? To kind of invest in a building that's about looking after the dead. It's not the kind of project that you would normally expect to see in a kind of development project run by an international NGO or by kind of Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. So it's not that kind of model of development because it's been chosen by a group of people who have a different agenda for what they think of as modernity. And what the reason for this is that if you live in London or in Washington or in Maryland or indeed in Yaoundé or Douala and you want to come back for the burial of a family member, you're going to have to be back within 2 or 3 days if you just use traditional mortuary techniques because we're in the tropics. So you can maintain a body, a corpse, safely for 2 or 3 days, but after that you have to bury it. And what this building did was it enabled those corpses to be kept for weeks or months even, so that communities around the world could gather resources and then come back and have a burial and everyone could be present. And what happened as a result of this was that the burials got bigger and bigger, and there's a kind of extended burial ceremonies and death celebrations as well that kind of expand. So you've got this kind of global concentration of diaspora capital being invested in these enormous ceremonies, which kind of 3,000-4,000 people might attend and which will run for 3 or 4 or 5 days even, all on the back of this development project. All right, we're there. So, at the start, I said I had 2 aims: to look back over some of my past work and reflect on what I've learned, and second, to try and kind of work this kind of concept of extimacy and challenging the inside-outside distinction to kind of get us to think about that in a different way. And I think, to me, there's some sense in that. It does kind of bring something new, this kind of introducing extimacy. It makes some sense to think about this kind of constant sense that we all have as subjects, that something might be missing from our lives. We're all searching for fulfillment, love, knowledge, a sense of belonging, holiness, prosperity, social kudos. And as we pursue projects that promise to fill that gap, projects like decorating a front room, contributing to your hometown development, or projects like trying to understand the ideas of Jacques Lacan, or trying to understand social change in Cameroon. But whenever we succeed in meeting our objectives, we discover there's something more we desire. We can't quite say what it is we're missing, but we feel it's there. So all the interviewees we talked to, who claimed to be so proud of their houses and satisfied with their parlours, also told us about their next project, a quarry, building a student hall of residence, another house in a different town, a building for my sister, restoring the palace, kitting out a hospital, reading volume 3 of Capital. They weren't at rest. They aren't at ease. In the same way, all the academics who finish one idea are already moving on to the next one, having discovered that this one didn't quite do all they'd hoped for, and actually they've just raised new questions. And a number of emeritus colleagues who remain active past retirement is telling. So the function of all this activity, Lacan argued, is to mask the sense that something is missing from our lives. Which some people might find a rather gloomy conclusion and place to end. So here is a picture of the Black Panther sitting on his throne in Wakanda. The significance, of course, is the Wakandan alphabet, which you can make out underneath his throne. I should have turned the lights down, shouldn't I, James? Sorry. But you can just about make out the text underneath his throne. According to the film's production designer, Hannah Beechler, this text is partly based on Cameroonian Nsibidi, and there are other Nsibidi symbols found across the throne room in different parts of the Black Panther movie. Nsibidi is a system of graphic communication believed to go back at least 4,000 years as far as the archaeological evidence is concerned, and it's thought to originate amongst the Ajagam people who live on both sides of the colonial border of Cameroon and Nigeria. And the symbols of Nsibidi, of which around 1,000 have been identified, refer to ideas, actions and objects. They can be gestures written in the air, on skin as tattoos, on buildings, textiles or on masks. And in particular, Nsibidi was used by Ikpe, a so-called secret society whose lodges of members stretched from modern-day Calabar on the coast, along the Cross River, into or out of Manu in southwest Cameroon, and Ikpe remains active today. Nsibidi symbols enabled communication, trade and diplomacy between these different lodges of this society because their members didn't all speak the same language. So it's a kind of system that enables communication. So, last line, from, which is ironic. You know that anyway, I'll tell you. From inside the deep interior of a mysterious, exotic, secret society in the dark heart of the forests of Manu, to light projections playing on the surfaces of tens of thousands of cinema screens worldwide, the inside of Cameroon all over the outside. Thank you.
Ben, that was brilliant. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be asked to do this. My name's Claire Mercer. I'm Professor of Human Geography down the road at the London School of Economics. And Ben and I have known each other. We think we met at the AAG in New York in 2001 in a session that we were organising on post-colonial African geographies. And I remember being really excited to meet Ben. We'd just finished our PhDs. There weren't actually that many geographers in the UK working on Africa, so I was really excited to get to know Ben more. And I was also slightly wary of him because around that time you published a chapter in Heather Viles and Alistair Rogers' book called The Student's Companion to Geography. And the title of the chapter was Showers of Blessing, Critical Geography and Development Studies. I just never had met anyone who published a chapter with the title Showers of Blessing in it. So I was slightly, I thought it was a slightly audacious title, and of course that has carried on with your knack for good titles. One of my favourites is the one that we wrote about remittances, which Ben titled, Why Do People Do Stuff? So we know each other because we've also had a research grant together, and we've worked together, we've done field work together, so I feel I've had a very privileged opportunity to get to know Ben's work over the years. So I want to say something about this amazing tour de force we've had through Ben's work this evening. We've been treated to a fascinating set of reflections on almost 30 years of path-breaking work on development in Africa. And as we've seen in tonight's lecture, Ben has always insisted that development matters to people, but not in the way that Western development experts or the development community expects. And he takes that seriously, and that's led him to examine, as we've seen, parlours, architecture, mortuaries, but also weddings and cars, that development theory doesn't even see. And I think that's one of the things that you've contributed to our understanding of development more widely. And this willingness to experiment, to think outside of the box, to think counterintuitively, the collage approach that Ben's outlined to us tonight. I think that gives us this kind of fascinating opportunity to try and think otherwise, to be more creative. And the creativity of your work, I think, really comes through, and it's come through in what you've shared with us this evening. Trying to think about development through the lens of psychoanalytic theory, taking people's desire for development seriously, allows us to see these things in different ways, as you've shown to us this evening. But never for the sake of trying to be novel, always in ways that try to explain something on the ground in Cameroon, as you've pointed out. So whenever I pick up something new that Ben's read, I don't know where it's going to take me, and that's exciting. I know it's going to be worth reading. However, Ben's willingness to be something of a magpie can also be exasperating if you're working with him. As my colleague Martin Evans and I found out when we were doing this massive survey with 10 enumerators in Cameroon, and one of the enumerators was saying, but doing it on a survey and just closed-ended questions, we're losing so much information. And Ben cheerfully went, well, that's all right, we're just doing this to show that surveys don't work. Which quite Martin-like. But although Ben has characterised himself as a dabbler, as the surface expertise or a magpie, as has come through this evening, his real depth of knowledge and expertise on Cameroon and West Africa more broadly is absolutely central to his scholarship. And even though he might claim to be sceptical about humanism, he's deeply and acutely attuned to the human experience, to ideas, to desires, to emotions and to feelings. He's an exceptional ethnographer. I have learned more from doing a couple of interviews with Ben in Cameroon than I have in any fieldwork methodology class. He's just incredibly skilled at putting people at ease, building relationships, and having a conversation with people in ways that elicits just such profound insights into how people feel. And it's not about extracting information, it's quite the opposite. It is about building relationships with people. And Ben is loved and respected by many in Cameroon, as evidenced by his recent invitation to speak at the Festschrift for Professor Lambie on the occasion of his retirement at the University of Buea. He's also able to translate those conversations that he has with people in the field into really clear writing, and this commitment to staying true to what those people have told him and working it through no matter what the consequences, theoretically, which can also be frustrating writing, but that real commitment to what the conversations that you've had I think, is characteristic of your work. Finally, and I feel like I'm repeating a little bit what Jason said earlier, just the personal quality that stands out for me, for Ben, is loyalty. And again, although he's argued against theoretical loyalty, he is an incredibly loyal person, as you know, so many of you in the room know from personal experience. Loyalty to Cameroon and your collaborators, loyalty to Halstow Road and South East London. I mean, you know, he's even taken his master's students to the Crossness Victorian sewage pumping station in Thamesmead in an attempt to get to show international students the delight of South East London. And his loyalty to his students and his colleagues, which underpins everything that he does. He believes, as Jason said, passionately in teaching, from first-year introductory courses, dissertation courses, specialised master's teaching, and really careful PhD supervision. And they're all important to you. And I think what this evening shows, and the fact that we're all here, is that you are also important to us. And so, Ben, we look forward to your next foray into seeing things afresh. Congratulations.
All right, folks.